My wife of 17 years served me divorce papers at my mother's funeral. Your family fortune is legally mine now. She smirked. My children refused to even look at me. We're changing our last name to Mom's Lovers, they announced. You're dead to us anyway. I nodded silently and walked away. 2 weeks later, as they celebrated at their new mansion, my lawyer delivered an envelope. My daughter called hysterically. How could you hide this from us? I replied, you chose your side. Now live with it. You know what's funny about being in the security business? You spend your whole damn life looking for threats everywhere except the place they're most likely to hit you, right at home. I'm Julian Mercer, and I've built an empire out of paranoia. Mercer Security isn't just some rinky-dink alarm company you see advertised on late-night TV. We're the real deal: corporate espionage prevention, cyber warfare defense, surveillance systems that could track a mouse through a maze. Hell, I've got contracts with Fortune 500 companies who trust me to protect their billion-dollar secrets. Governments call me when they need someone who can see the invisible threats coming from a mile away. But apparently, I'm blind as a bat when it comes to my own wife screwing around behind my back. Looking back now, the signs were there like neon billboards in Times Square, and I just kept driving past them like some clueless tourist. Isadora started changing about 8 months ago, and I mean really changing. Not just the usual, I need space, or we should try new things kind of changes that married couples go through. This was different. This was calculated. First, it was the phone thing. My wife, who used to leave her iPhone lying around like yesterday's newspaper, suddenly started guarding that thing like it contained nuclear launch codes. She'd take it with her to the bathroom, keep it face down during dinner, and God forbid I walked into a room while she was texting. She'd flip that screen faster than a Vegas dealer shuffling cards. When I asked her about it, she'd give me this look like I was some kind of psycho for even noticing. Since when do you care about my phone, Julian? What are you, the NSA now? Then came the whispered phone calls. Late at night, she'd slip out onto the balcony or into the guest bathroom, thinking I was asleep. But here's the thing about being in my line of work. You develop ears like a bloodhound. I could hear the change in her voice, that soft, intimate tone she used to reserve just for me. She was talking to someone the way you talk to someone you're falling for, not the way you talk to your yoga instructor or your sister or whoever the hell she claimed was calling at midnight. The work retreats were the real kicker, though. Isadora ran a small art consultancy, nothing major, mostly helping rich people figure out what expensive paintings to hang in their McMansions. But suddenly, she's jetting off to conferences in Napa Valley and networking events in the Hamptons every other weekend. Art consultants don't have conferences like pharmaceutical reps, but what do I know? I'm just the guy who built a multi-million-dollar security empire from scratch. Every time she'd come back from these little getaways, she'd be glowing like she'd just discovered the fountain of youth. New clothes, new jewelry, new perfume that smelled like money and bad decisions. When I asked her about it, she'd get defensive faster than a cornered cat. Can't a woman invest in herself without getting the third degree? You should be happy I'm taking care of my appearance. But the real wake-up call came from our daughter Delilah. Sweet, innocent, 17-year-old Delilah, who still believed the world was full of fairy tales and happy endings. She bounced into my home office one Thursday evening, practically vibrating with excitement, her wrist sparkling like a disco ball. Dad, look what Uncle Damien got me, she squealed, shoving her arm in my face. Uncle Damien. That's when my blood went cold. The bracelet was Cartier, I could tell from 50 feet away. White gold with diamonds that probably cost more than most people's cars. This wasn't some trinket you pick up at the mall. This was serious jewelry, the kind of gift a man gives to a woman he's trying to impress. Or to a woman's daughter when he's trying to buy his way into a family. Uncle Damien? I asked, keeping my voice level even though every alarm bell in my head was going off like a fire station during a 5-alarm blaze. Mom's new art sponsor, Delilah said, admiring the way the diamonds caught the light. He's super cool, Dad. He owns all these galleries, and he's helping Mom expand her business. He said I reminded him of his niece, so he wanted to get me something special. Damien Rourke. I knew that name, and not from any art circles. Rourke was a real estate developer with a reputation for cutting corners and bending rules. New money, flashy lifestyle, the kind of guy who wore Armani suits and drove Ferraris because he thought it made him look sophisticated. He'd been in the papers a few times. Nothing criminal, just your typical rich guy drama about zoning disputes and city council palm greasing. That night, after Isadora went to sleep, I did what I do best. I investigated. One phone call to my lawyer Inez, one check of property records, one dive into social media accounts that people think are private but really aren't. The trail was easier to follow than breadcrumbs in a fairy tale. Rourke had been sponsoring Isadora's art consultancy for about 6 months, right around the time she started acting strange. But here's the kicker. He wasn't just funding her business. He was funding her lifestyle. Hotel receipts, restaurant charges, jewelry purchases. All traced back to accounts connected to Damien Rourke Enterprises. My wife wasn't just cheating on me. She was being kept like some kind of high-end mistress. The smart move would have been to confront her right then and there. Storm into the bedroom, throw the evidence in her face, demand explanations and apologies, and all that dramatic bullshit you see in movies. But I didn't get where I am by making emotional decisions. I got here by being patient, methodical, and always thinking 3 moves ahead. So I didn't confront her. I didn't scream or throw things or hire a private investigator to take compromising photos. Instead, I did what I do best. I calculated. I documented everything, built a case file that would make the FBI jealous, and started moving pieces on a chessboard that Isadora didn't even know we were playing on. Because here's what my cheating wife and her sugar daddy didn't understand. You don't betray a man who's made his fortune by seeing threats coming from miles away and expect to walk away clean. You especially don't do it when that man has resources, connections, and a very long memory for people who cross him. I waited for the final act, knowing it was coming. I just had to be patient enough to let them hang themselves with their own rope. You'd think there'd be some kind of unwritten rule about not dropping nuclear bombs on someone's life at their mother's funeral, but apparently my wife never got that memo. Then again, Isadora always did have a flair for the dramatic. I just never thought she'd weaponize it at the worst possible moment of my life. The morning of Mom's funeral was one of those perfect October days that makes you think God's got a twisted sense of humor. Crystal blue sky, leaves turning all those Instagram-worthy shades of gold and red. Temperature just cool enough that you didn't sweat through your black suit. It was the kind of day Mom would have loved, the kind of day that made you forget, just for a second, that you were about to put the most important person in your world into the ground forever. I'd been dreading this day for months, ever since the doctors told us the cancer had spread too far, too fast. Elizabeth Mercer was tougher than a $2 steak, but even she couldn't fight stage 4 pancreatic cancer. She went from running the family foundation and bossing around CEOs twice her size to barely being able to hold a conversation in the span of 6 weeks. Watching someone that strong just fade away? It's the kind of thing that rewrites your whole understanding of what matters in life. The service was held at St. Catherine's, the same church where Mom had dragged me every Sunday until I was old enough to argue my way out of it. Half of Philadelphia's business elite showed up to pay their respects. CEOs, politicians, old money families who'd known the Mercers for 3 generations. Mom would have been proud of the turnout, probably would have made some smart-ass comment about how she should have died sooner if it meant getting this much attention. I stood at the front of the church during the eulogy, trying to hold it together while Father Martinez talked about Mom's legacy of service and her dedication to family. Isadora stood right beside me, playing the part of the grieving daughter-in-law perfectly. She even had the audacity to reach over and squeeze my hand during the part about Mom's loving family carrying on her memory. I should have known something was up right then. Isadora hadn't voluntarily touched me in months. After the service, we all filed out to the cemetery for the burial. That's when things got surreal in a way that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. I'm standing there watching them lower my mother's casket into the ground, trying to process the fact that I'm officially an orphan now, when Isadora steps closer to me, not in a comforting way, but in that predatory way she'd perfected over the past few months. "Julian," she said, and her voice had this weird calmness to it that made every nerve in my body stand up and salute. It was the tone she used when she was about to deliver bad news, like when she told me she'd crashed the Mercedes or when Grayson got suspended for cheating on his SATs. She reached into her black Hermes purse, a bag I'd bought her for our anniversary last year, back when I still thought we were playing on the same team, and pulled out a thick manila envelope. The kind lawyers use when they want to make sure you know your life is about to get turned upside down and shaken like a snow globe. Here, she said, holding it out to me like it was a birthday present instead of a pipe bomb with a lit fuse. I took the envelope, my hands moving on autopilot while my brain tried to catch up with what was happening. The cemetery was still full of people, friends, business associates, family members who'd traveled from across the country to pay their respects. Everyone was watching, waiting to offer their condolences, and here's my wife handing me what looked suspiciously like legal documents at my mother's graveside. I opened the envelope with the kind of sick fascination you feel when you're about to look at a car accident. The papers inside were exactly what I'd feared, divorce documents, filed and official, with more signatures than a celebrity autograph session. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the asset division breakdown, the part where I saw just how thoroughly Isadora had been planning this ambush. Your family fortune is legally mine now, she said, and the way she said it, so matter-of-fact, so goddamn casual, made me want to grab her by the shoulders and shake her until her teeth rattled. According to the papers, she'd somehow managed to claim rights to everything. The house, the company, the trust funds, even the vacation property in Martha's Vineyard that had been in my family for 40 years. I couldn't speak. Hell, I could barely breathe. Here I am, dirt from my mother's grave still fresh on my shoes, and my wife is basically telling me she's stolen everything I've ever worked for. It was like getting sucker punched by someone you trusted to watch your back. But wait, it gets worse. That's when Delilah and Grayson stepped forward, and the looks on their faces told me this wasn't some spur-of-the-moment decision. This was planned, coordinated, rehearsed. My own kids, the ones I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, were about to stick the knife in and twist it. We're changing our last name to Rourke, Delilah announced, and she said it with the kind of teenage defiance that usually gets directed at curfews and dress codes, not at completely destroying your father's life. Grayson, my 16-year-old son who used to beg me to take him to Phillies games, just nodded along like a puppet. You're dead to us anyway, he said, and those words hit harder than any physical blow I've ever taken. Dead to them. My own children, standing at their grandmother's funeral, telling me I'm dead to them while their mother hands me divorce papers like party favors. I looked around at the crowd of mourners, all of them pretending not to stare while this family drama played out like some twisted episode of a soap opera. I could see the shock on their faces, the whispered conversations that were already starting. By tomorrow, half of Philadelphia would know that Julian Mercer got divorced at his mother's funeral by a wife who'd apparently been planning this ambush for months. I should have said something. Should have defended myself, fought back, made a scene that would have at least let everyone know I wasn't going down without a fight. But instead, I just stood there like an idiot, holding those papers and watching my entire life fall apart in real time. Finally, I did the only thing that made sense in that moment. I nodded, just once, like I was acknowledging that I'd received the message loud and clear, and walked away. No dramatic speeches, no threats, no begging for explanations. I just turned around and walked to my car, leaving my wife and children standing by my mother's grave like the strangers they'd apparently become. The drive home was a blur of rage and disbelief, but underneath all that chaos, one thought kept running through my head like a broken record. They had no idea what was coming next, because while they'd been busy planning their little funeral ambush, I'd been busy preparing for war. And in war, the side that strikes first doesn't always win. Sometimes it just reveals their position to an enemy who's been waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. 2 weeks. That's how long it took for my former family to completely erase me from their lives and move on like I'd never existed in the first place. 2 weeks for them to pack up everything they thought mattered and relocate to their shiny new life with Damian Rourke. 2 weeks for me to sit in the silence of my empty house and watch them celebrate what they thought was their victory. But here's what they didn't understand about silence. It's not surrender. It's preparation. The house felt like a mausoleum after they left. Isadora took everything she legally could and plenty of stuff that was questionable, but I didn't fight her on any of it. Why would I? Let her have the crystal vases and the designer furniture and all those material things she'd always valued more than the people who bought them for her. I had more important things to focus on, like watching my children pose for Instagram photos in their new mansion like they'd just won the lottery instead of betraying the man who'd given them everything. Damien's place was something else, a gaudy monument to new money sitting on 20 acres in the main line's most exclusive neighborhood. 8 bedrooms, 12 bathrooms, a wine cellar that could stock a restaurant, and a pool that looked like it belonged at a Vegas resort. The kind of house that screams, "Look how rich I am," to anyone within a 5-mile radius. Perfect for a guy like Rourke, who confused expensive with classy and thought throwing money around was the same thing as having taste. From my perspective, though, it might as well have been a prison. Because while they were busy posting pictures of themselves living their best life, I was busy documenting every single detail of their new reality. You don't spend 20 years in the security business without learning how to watch people without them knowing it. Traffic cameras, social media monitoring, credit card tracking. When you know what you're looking for, people's lives are basically open books. The social media stuff was almost too easy. Delilah couldn't post a sandwich without tagging her location, and Isadora had apparently decided that her new life required constant documentation for her followers. Champagne brunches on the terrace, shopping trips to Rittenhouse Square, dinner parties with Philadelphia's art scene elite. They were living like royalty and making sure everyone knew it. What killed me wasn't the luxury. Hell, I could have given them all that and more if they'd just been patient. What killed me was how happy they looked. Delilah, grinning like a pageant queen in her new Tiffany jewelry. Grayson, actually smiling for once instead of glaring at the world like it owed him something. And Isadora, looking 10 years younger and twice as beautiful as she had in months, like getting rid of me had been the best decision she'd ever made. But while they were busy playing house with their sugar daddy, I was busy with Inez, my lawyer, working on something they'd never see coming. See, the thing about being paranoid for a living is that you learn to prepare for the worst-case scenario long before it happens. And the worst-case scenario in my marriage had always been exactly this: betrayal, theft, and complete character assassination. So years ago, when things were still good between us, when I still trusted Isadora with my life and my fortune, I'd started building safeguards. Not because I didn't trust her, but because I didn't trust the world. Shell companies registered in 3 different states. Decoy accounts that looked legitimate on paper, but contained just enough money to be convincing. Patent transfers and intellectual property rights that could be moved faster than a Vegas card sharp shuffles a deck. The real kicker was the asset transfers I'd been working on for the past 18 months. Every major component of Mercer Security, every valuable piece of technology, every profitable contract. All of it had been quietly, legally, and completely above-board transferred into a complex web of holding companies and trust funds that Isadora couldn't touch, with a 10-foot pole and a team of lawyers. She thought she'd won the company in the divorce. She'd won a name and an empty office building. The real assets, the stuff that actually made money, the intellectual property that was worth more than most people's entire net worth. All of that was locked up tighter than Fort Knox, and I was the only one with the combination. Inez had been working overtime to make sure every I was dotted and every T was crossed. We're talking about a legal maze so complex that it would take a team of forensic accountants months just to figure out where to start looking. And the beautiful part? It was all completely legal. Complicated as hell, sure, but legal as a Sunday morning church service. The patent loopholes alone were a work of art. See, when you invent security technology, you don't just patent the final product. You patent every component, every process, every potential variation that someone might try to steal or replicate. Over the years, I'd built up a portfolio of intellectual property that was worth more than most Fortune 500 companies. And every single one of those patents was now owned by entities that Isadora had never heard of and couldn't claim in a million years. Meanwhile, they were celebrating in their mansion, completely oblivious to the fact that they'd betrayed a man who'd spent his entire career building walls to keep enemies out. They thought they'd gotten inside those walls, stolen everything valuable, and escaped clean. What they didn't realize was that they'd actually locked themselves on the wrong side of the biggest wall of all. Every night, I'd sit in my study with a glass of 30-year-old Macallan and monitor their digital footprints. Credit card purchases, social media posts, location data from their phones. I could track their every move without leaving my house. It was like watching rats in a maze. Except these rats thought they were running free when they were actually just following the path I'd built for them. Because here's the thing about building an empire from scratch. You don't just learn how to create things. You learn how to destroy them too. And sometimes, destruction is just creation in reverse. Thursday afternoon rolled around gray and miserable, with the kind of rain that makes you want to stay inside and pretend the world doesn't exist. Perfect weather for what I had planned. I'd been watching the forecast all week, waiting for exactly this kind of day, the kind where people are distracted, irritable, and not paying attention to details. The kind of day when a simple courier delivery could change everything. Kieran showed up at my office at exactly 2:30, punctual as always. I'd been using him for sensitive deliveries for 3 years now, ever since Inez recommended him. Former Marine, built like a linebacker, with the kind of stone-faced professionalism that made him perfect for jobs that required absolute discretion. He never asked questions, never made small talk, and never, ever screwed up a delivery. Worth every penny of what I paid him, especially for jobs like this one. You know the drill, I told him, handing over the envelope. It was thick, expensive paper, the kind that feels important when you hold it. Inside was a single document that had taken Inez 3 weeks to prepare and another week to verify with 3 different legal experts. One page that was about to blow up my ex-wife's world like a hand grenade in a flower shop. Same as always, Mr. Mercer, Kieran said, tucking the envelope into his weatherproof messenger bag. Hand delivery only, signature required, no substitutes. I watched him drive away in his unmarked sedan, then settled back in my chair to wait. The mansion was exactly 43 minutes away in normal traffic, maybe 50 in this weather. That gave me just enough time to pour myself a drink and pull up the security feeds I'd been monitoring for weeks. Yeah, I had eyes on their house. Not illegal surveillance. Nothing that would hold up in court anyway, but the kind of digital monitoring that any decent security expert could set up if they knew what they were looking for. Traffic cameras, satellite imagery, social media geolocation data. When you know the system well enough, you can see almost anything without technically breaking any laws. The feed showed Isadora's black Range Rover in the circular driveway, which meant she was home. Good. Damien's Ferrari was nowhere to be seen, which was even better. This conversation needed to happen without her sugar daddy whispering in her ear about damage control and legal strategies. At exactly 3:27, I watched Kieran's sedan pull through the mansion's ridiculous gold-plated gates. The whole property looked like something out of a rap video, all marble columns and fountain sculptures that probably cost more than most people's houses. Damien had definitely gone all out trying to impress his new trophy wife, and from the look of things, it had worked. My phone was already ringing before Kieran had even gotten back to his car. It wasn't Isadora, though. It was Delilah, and she was crying before I even said hello. Not the manipulative, crocodile tears she'd perfected over the years when she wanted something, but the raw, ugly kind of crying that happens when your whole world suddenly stops making sense. "How could you hide this from us?" she sobbed into the phone, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. She was probably standing in that gaudy foyer, surrounded by all of Damien's expensive bullshit, holding the document that explained exactly how badly they'd miscalculated. The original estate transfer, Mom's final gift to me, and her final middle finger to anyone who thought they could steal from the Mercer family legacy. 3 months before she died, when she was still sharp as a tack despite the cancer eating her alive, she'd called me into her hospital room for what I thought was just another one of our regular strategy sessions. "Julian," she'd said, gripping my hand with fingers that felt like bird bones, "I need you to understand something. This family has survived 3 generations of people trying to tear us down, and we're not about to let some gold-digging bitch and her sleazy boyfriend finish the job." I tried to tell her that Isadora wasn't that bad, that maybe we could work things out, but Mom had just looked at me with those steel gray eyes that had intimidated CEOs and politicians for 40 years. "Trust me on this one, son. A woman who's planning to betray you doesn't suddenly start wearing new jewelry and taking mysterious trips without a damn good reason. And when she makes her move, you need to be ready." So we'd rewritten everything. The house, the company shares, the trust funds, the investment portfolios, all of it placed in a private family trust that bypassed probate completely. Isadora could have the divorce decree and the temporary court orders, but she couldn't touch the real money. Not without my signature, and not without jumping through legal hoops that would take years to navigate. The beauty of it was that it was all completely legitimate. Mom had been of sound mind when she signed the papers. 3 different doctors had verified her mental competency, and everything had been filed with the appropriate courts months before her death. Inez had made sure every single detail was bulletproof. The mansion? I said into the phone, keeping my voice level despite the satisfaction that was bubbling up in my chest like champagne. Not yours. The company shares? Temporarily suspended pending trust verification. The trust fund accounts? Only accessible through me. I could hear Delilah hyperventilating on the other end of the line. Could picture her standing there in her designer clothes and her Cartier jewelry, finally realizing that all their celebrating had been premature. They'd thrown a victory party before they'd actually won the war. But the divorce papers? She started to say, but I cut her off. The divorce papers gave your mother rights to marital assets, I explained, like I was talking to a particularly slow child. But the family trust isn't a marital asset. It's a generational legacy that passes from parent to child. And since you chose to change your name to Rourke, well, legally speaking, you're not my children anymore, are you? The silence on the other end of the phone was so complete that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then I heard Grayson's voice in the background, asking what was wrong, followed by Isadora's sharp intake of breath as she grabbed the phone. Julian, you bastard, she hissed. And there was the real Isadora, not the grieving widow from the funeral or the loving mother from social media, but the calculating predator I'd been married to for 18 years. You chose your side, I said, echoing the words she'd thrown at me at Mom's funeral. Now live with it. And then I hung up the phone and poured myself another drink, because the real fun was just getting started. Going ghost was easier than I'd expected. One day, I was Julian Mercer, betrayed husband and discarded father, and the next I was just another shadow in Philadelphia's business district. I kept my office, kept my routines, kept showing up to the monthly charity board meetings that Mom had roped me into years ago. To the outside world, I looked like a man who was handling his divorce with quiet dignity. Nobody needed to know that I was actually orchestrating the most satisfying revenge campaign of my professional career. The beauty of disappearing in plain sight is that people stop paying attention to you. They see what they expect to see, a guy who got screwed over by his wife and is trying to pick up the pieces. Meanwhile, my former family was putting on the performance of their lives, and I had front row seats to watch the whole damn show. Damien really went all out playing the role of generous stepfather. Every morning at 7:45, he'd roll up to Grayson's prep school in that ridiculous Tesla Model S, acting like he was doing the kid some huge favor by giving him a ride. Grayson would hop out looking like he'd just won the lottery, designer backpack slung over his shoulder, probably feeling like the coolest kid in school because his new dad drove an electric sports car instead of the boring Mercedes I used to drive. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd offered to buy Grayson any car he wanted for his 16th birthday, within reason, of course. But he'd turned his nose up at the idea, said he didn't want to look like some spoiled rich kid. Apparently, being a spoiled rich kid was only embarrassing when the money came from his actual father. Isadora was having the time of her life playing art gallery owner with Damien's money. She'd opened this boutique place in Rittenhouse Square, all white walls and pretentious lighting, specializing in what she called emerging contemporary artists. Translation: overpriced paintings that looked like someone had sneezed paint onto a canvas and called it art. But the mainline crowd was eating it up, probably because Damien's name was attached to it, and everyone wanted to stay on his good side. I drive by sometimes, just to see her in her element. She'd be in there wearing those flowing scarves and oversized jewelry that gallery owners seem to think make them look sophisticated, chatting up customers who had more money than sense. She looked happier than I'd seen her in years, like she'd finally found her true calling as a kept woman with artistic pretensions. But here's the thing about watching people through security cameras and digital surveillance. You see everything, not just the highlight reel they post on Instagram. You see the moments when they think nobody's looking, when the masks slip and the real emotions show through. Like when the credit cards started getting declined. It started small, a transaction here, a purchase there. Nothing dramatic, just little hiccups that could be explained away as bank errors or temporary holds. But I was monitoring every single financial account connected to Damien Rourke Enterprises, and I could see the pattern developing like storm clouds on the horizon. The first real crack came at Nordstrom, where Delilah tried to buy a $3,000 handbag, and her card got rejected faster than a bad check. The sales associate was polite about it, probably figured it was just a temporary glitch, but I watched my daughter's face through the store's security camera as she called Damien to fix the problem. The confusion, then the embarrassment, then the slow dawning realization that maybe their fairy tale life wasn't as secure as they'd thought. The account flags started multiplying like rabbits. Bank holds, credit freezes, automatic fraud alerts, all triggered by the financial forensics team I'd hired to trace every dollar that had flowed between Damien's accounts and my family's new lifestyle. It wasn't illegal. Hell, it was barely unethical. I was just exercising my right as a concerned citizen to report suspicious financial activity to the appropriate authorities. The IRS notices were my personal favorite touch. Nothing says your life is about to get complicated quite like an official government envelope asking detailed questions about unreported income and gift tax obligations. Turns out that when someone starts throwing around expensive jewelry and luxury vacations without declaring them properly, Uncle Sam gets very interested in having a conversation. I watched Delilah cry in her walk-in closet when the college fund got frozen pending investigation. She'd been so excited about early admission to Columbia, had already started shopping for dorm room furniture and planning her freshman year social calendar. Now she was sitting on the floor of her mansion bedroom, surrounded by designer clothes that might as well have been costumes, sobbing because her future had just disappeared in a puff of bureaucratic smoke. Damien's reaction was even better. I caught him on the mansion's security camera. Yeah, I'd figured out how to tap into their system weeks ago, screaming at Isadora in the driveway like some kind of trailer park drama. All that smooth sophistication he'd been projecting just evaporated when the money pressure started building. Turned out that underneath all those Armani suits and Italian leather shoes, he was just another small-time crook who'd gotten in over his head. The shoplifting incident was the cherry on top of this whole shit sundae. Grayson, my honor roll son who'd never stolen so much as a candy bar in his 16 years of life, got caught trying to walk out of GameStop with a $100 video game because his debit card got declined and he was too embarrassed to call home for help. The store manager recognized the Rourke name. Damien had made enough of a splash in local society that people knew who he was, so they didn't press charges. But I had friends in retail security who made sure the incident got documented properly. Through it all, I stayed invisible. I was the phantom in their machine, the ghost in their system, watching their perfect new life crumble piece by piece while they tried to figure out why everything was going wrong at once. They knew it couldn't all be coincidence, but they couldn't prove anything. And even if they could, what were they going to do? Call the police and report that their stolen fortune was being stolen back? The best part was that I wasn't even breaking any laws. Every account freeze, every investigation, every bureaucratic roadblock, it was all the natural consequence of their own greed and stupidity. They'd just been too drunk on Damien's money to see the trap closing around them until it was too late to escape. The liquidation phase was Inez's masterpiece, and watching her work was like watching a master chef prepare a 7-course meal of pure legal destruction. She'd been building this case for months, methodically documenting every questionable transaction, every suspicious asset transfer, every piece of evidence that showed my dear ex-wife had been systematically looting what she thought was community property to fund her new lifestyle with her boyfriend. But here's where things got really interesting, and where Damien Rourke's past came back to bite him in the ass harder than a pit bull with anger management issues. See, while Isadora thought she was just stealing from her soon-to-be ex-husband, she was actually helping her sugar daddy launder money from sources that would make the IRS cream their collective pants with excitement. Mara, my head of digital forensics, had been working overtime tracing financial breadcrumbs that led back to Damien's real estate empire. What we found was better than Christmas morning, and a winning lottery ticket rolled into one beautiful, legally actionable package. This guy wasn't just cutting corners on building permits and zoning regulations. He was running a full-scale money laundering operation disguised as high-end property development. The offshore wire transfers were the smoking gun that tied everything together. Over the past 18 months, Damien had been moving money through a network of shell companies that made my own asset protection strategies look like child's play. Bahamas, Cayman Islands, Swiss accounts that existed only on paper. This bastard had been washing dirty money from sources I didn't even want to think about and using legitimate real estate deals as cover. And my brilliant ex-wife? She'd been helping him do it, probably without even realizing what she was signing her name to. Every gallery investment, every art acquisition, every luxury purchase that had funded their fairy tale lifestyle. It was all tainted money that could be traced back to drug cartels and human trafficking operations that the feds had been investigating for years. The anonymous tip I submitted to the FBI wasn't even technically anonymous. I just used one of those encrypted communication systems that whistleblowers use when they want to report crimes without painting targets on their backs. 3 days after I sent them Mara's complete financial analysis, along with bank records, transaction logs, and enough evidence to fill a small library, my morning coffee got a whole lot more interesting. Damian Rourke under investigation for fraud, possible conspiracy to defraud estate. The headline hit the Philadelphia Inquirer's website at 6:30 a.m. on a Tuesday, and by noon it was trending on every social media platform in the tri-state area. The accompanying article was a thing of beauty. Federal agents executing search warrants, frozen bank accounts, testimonies from construction workers who'd been paid in cash for jobs that officially never existed. But the real kicker was the connection to my family's stolen assets. The article mentioned that investigators were looking into suspicious transfers of wealth from prominent Philadelphia families, and that charges related to estate fraud and conspiracy were likely. Suddenly, Isadora wasn't just the victim of her ex-husband's vindictive behavior. She was a potential accomplice in a federal money laundering investigation. The gallery shuttered overnight like someone had hit it with a neutron bomb. One day it was hosting wine and cheese events for mainline socialites, and the next day it had federal seizure notices taped to the windows and crime scene tape blocking the entrance. All those expensive paintings and sculptures that Isadora had been so proud of? Frozen assets pending investigation. The lease on that fancy Rittenhouse Square location? Terminated due to suspected criminal activity. Watching Delilah lose her scholarship was like watching someone get punched in the gut in slow motion. Columbia University doesn't mess around when it comes to reputation management. And having a prospective student whose family is under federal investigation for money laundering is exactly the kind of publicity nightmare they spend millions of dollars trying to avoid. The acceptance letter got rescinded faster than a bad restaurant review, and with it went all of Delilah's dreams of becoming a big-shot journalism major in New York City. Grayson's expulsion from prep school was almost anticlimactic after everything else. Apparently, when your tuition payments are connected to frozen accounts that are part of a federal investigation, even the most exclusive private schools suddenly discover they have moral standards. The official reason was failure to meet financial obligations, but everyone knew what it really meant. The Rourke name had become toxic, and nobody wanted to be associated with it. That's when Inez filed for full custody, and let me tell you, it was like watching a legal sniper take out targets from a mile away. She'd been preparing this move for weeks, building an airtight case that painted me as the stable, law-abiding parent and Isadora as a woman who'd knowingly participated in criminal activity while endangering her children's welfare and future prospects. The court moved faster than I'd expected, probably because judges don't like having their dockets cluttered up with families connected to federal investigations. Within 72 hours of the initial hearing, Isadora found herself with frozen assets, no legal representation she could afford, and no standing to fight for custody of children who were living in a house purchased with laundered money. The temporary guardian arrangement was just a formality, a legal speed bump while the court processed my petition for full custody. But even that brief separation sent a message that echoed through every corner of their collapsing world. The fairy tale was over, and reality was about to set in like a February morning in Siberia. Meanwhile, Damian was already making his exit strategy. The yacht disappeared from the marina 3 days before the federal warrants were executed, and according to my sources in the Coast Guard, it was spotted heading south toward international waters. Smart move, actually. Mexico doesn't have an extradition treaty that covers financial crimes, and he probably had enough hidden assets stashed away to live comfortably as a fugitive for the rest of his miserable life. But here's what really got to me. Through all of this chaos, through the federal investigation and the frozen accounts, and a complete destruction of everything they'd built together. I still hadn't spoken to my children in 2 months. They were about to become my responsibility again, but they were also complete strangers who'd chosen to betray me at the worst moment of my life. The question wasn't whether I could forgive them. It was whether they could earn back the right to be called my kids. The news broke on a Wednesday morning like a dam bursting after months of pressure building behind it. I was sitting in my office, sipping coffee that actually tasted good for the first time in weeks, when every major news outlet in Philadelphia started running the same story simultaneously. Damian Rourke under investigation for fraud, possible conspiracy to defraud estate. The words looked even better in print than they had in my imagination. Channel 6 led with it on their morning broadcast, complete with footage of FBI agents carrying boxes out of Damian's corporate headquarters. The reporter, some blonde kid who looked like she'd graduated journalism school about 5 minutes ago, was practically salivating as she described the scope of the investigation. Money laundering, racketeering, conspiracy to commit fraud. It was like a greatest hits album of white-collar crime, and my ex-wife's boyfriend was the headlining act. By noon, the story had legs. CNN picked it up, then Fox Business, then the Wall Street Journal. Apparently, when a Philadelphia real estate mogul gets investigated for running dirty money through luxury developments, it's the kind of story that sells newspapers and drives web traffic. The fact that it involved stolen estate money and a messy divorce just made it more delicious for the media vultures circling overhead. Isadora's gallery shuttered so fast, it was like watching a magic trick in reverse. One day it was the toast of Rittenhouse Square, hosting wine tastings for people with more money than taste, and the next day it had federal seizure notices plastered across the windows like some kind of legal graffiti. All those overpriced paintings and sculptures that she'd been so proud of, government property now, pending the outcome of an investigation that was going to take years to resolve. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. Isadora had always fancied herself as some kind of art world sophisticate, curating collections for people who wanted to look cultured without actually understanding what they were buying. Now she was about to become famous in art circles for all the wrong reasons. As the gallery owner who got shut down for laundering drug money through abstract expressionism and modern sculpture. Delilah took it the hardest, which shouldn't have surprised me, but somehow did. My daughter, who'd been so quick to throw her father under the bus for a Cartier bracelet and a mansion bedroom, completely fell apart when reality came knocking on her door like a debt collector with a court order. Columbia University didn't just rescind her acceptance. They did it publicly, with a statement about maintaining institutional integrity and distancing themselves from families under federal investigation. Watching her lose that scholarship was like watching someone's dreams get fed through a paper shredder in real time. She'd been planning her college years since she was 14, had her whole life mapped out like some kind of strategic campaign. Journalism major, internship at a major newspaper, maybe law school after that. Now she was just another rich kid whose family got caught up in a scandal, and every college admissions officer in the country was going to know her name for all the wrong reasons. Grayson's expulsion from prep school was almost anticlimactic after everything else, but it hit him harder than I'd expected. That kid had always been my little rebel, the one who acted like he didn't care about prestige or status or fitting in with the right crowd. But losing his spot at one of Philadelphia's most exclusive schools, getting kicked out not for bad grades or disciplinary problems, but because his family had become a liability. That cut deeper than any academic failure could have. The prep school didn't even try to be subtle about it. Failure to meet financial obligations was the official reason, but everyone knew what it really meant. When your tuition payments are connected to frozen accounts that are part of a federal money laundering investigation, even the most forgiving institutions suddenly develop strict moral standards. That's when Inez made her move, and watching her work was like watching a master chess player execute a strategy that had been planned 20 moves in advance. She filed for full custody with a legal brief that was basically a greatest hits collection of everything Isadora had done wrong over the past year. Knowingly participating in financial crimes, endangering the welfare of minor children, associating with individuals under federal investigation. It was a character assassination disguised as legal documentation. The court moved faster than a NASCAR pit crew on race day. Judges don't like having their dockets cluttered up with families connected to ongoing federal investigations, and they especially don't like cases where children's welfare might be compromised by parents who make questionable decisions about money and men. Within 72 hours of the initial hearing, Isadora found herself with no money, no lawyer she could afford, and no legal standing to fight for custody of kids who were living in a house purchased with laundered drug money. The temporary guardian arrangement was just a legal formality, a way for the court to cover its ass while processing my petition for full custody. But even that brief separation sent a message that echoed through every corner of their collapsing world. The fairy tale was officially over, and the cleanup crew was already on the way. Meanwhile, Damien was pulling his own disappearing act like some kind of bargain basement James Bond. The yacht vanished from the marina faster than evidence at a mob trial, and according to my contacts in maritime security, it was spotted heading south toward waters where extradition treaties become more like friendly suggestions than actual legal obligations. Smart move, actually. Mexico had become a popular retirement destination for Americans with complicated legal problems and offshore bank accounts. But here's what really got under my skin. Through all of this chaos, through the federal investigation and the media circus and the complete implosion of everything they'd built together, I still hadn't spoken to my children in 2 months. They were about to become my legal responsibility again, but they were also complete strangers who'd chosen to betray their father at the lowest moment of his life. The question that kept me awake at night wasn't whether I could forgive them. It was whether they deserved the chance to earn back the right to call themselves Mercers. The first words Delilah spoke to me in 3 months came through a cracked voice and eyes that couldn't quite meet mine. She was standing in the modest 2-bedroom condo I'd secured for them in Center City. A far cry from the mansion they'd been living in, but clean and safe, and about all the luxury they deserved after everything they'd put me through. "We made a mistake," she said, and those 4 words carried more weight than all the apologies and explanations that would follow over the next several weeks. The kid looked like she'd aged 5 years in the span of a few months. Gone was the confident, entitled teenager who'd flaunted her Cartier bracelet and talked about changing her last name like it was some kind of upgrade. In her place stood a young woman who'd learned the hard way that actions have consequences and fairy tales don't always have happy endings. Grayson's approach was more direct, more honest in that brutal way that 16-year-old boys can be when they're forced to confront their own stupidity. "I didn't know," he said simply, and I believed him. My son had always been the follower in the family dynamic, more interested in video games and basketball than the complicated adult world of money and power and betrayal. He'd gone along with the name change because his mother and sister had told him it was the right thing to do, not because he'd actively chosen to betray his father. But knowing they were sorry and trusting them again were 2 completely different things, and I wasn't about to make the same mistake twice. Trust, real trust, isn't something you can rebuild with a few tearful conversations and promises to do better. It's something you earn back one day at a time, one decision at a time, one moment of choosing the right thing over the easy thing. So I set boundaries that were harder than prison walls and about as flexible as concrete. No mansion, obviously, that had been seized by the feds anyway. No inheritance, at least not until they proved they understood the difference between earning something and having it handed to them on a silver platter. No trust fund, no credit cards, no safety net that would let them slide back into their old habits of entitlement and casual cruelty. The condo was basic but functional. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that was big enough to cook actual meals if you were willing to put in the effort. I'd furnished it with stuff from IKEA and Target, the kind of furniture that normal people buy when they're starting their adult lives and don't have daddy's money to fall back on. They hated it at first, kept asking when they could move back to real accommodations, but eventually they started treating it like home instead of a temporary punishment. Therapy sessions became mandatory, not optional. Dr. Patricia Chun came highly recommended by Inez, specialized in family trauma and rebuilding relationships after betrayal. Twice a week, every week, no exceptions and no excuses. I didn't participate in the sessions myself. I wasn't ready for that level of emotional vulnerability yet, but I made sure they went, and I read Dr. Chin's progress reports religiously. Community service was another non-negotiable requirement. Delilah spent her Saturdays working at a homeless shelter downtown, serving meals to people who'd lost everything and learning what real hardship looked like. Grayson volunteered at a youth center in North Philly, helping kids who'd grown up without fathers figure out basic life skills that he'd always taken for granted. School became their full-time job, and I treated it like one. Grades, attendance, behavior reports, everything got monitored and documented. No more prep school connections or legacy admissions. They were going to earn their way into college the same way millions of other kids did, through hard work and academic achievement. I didn't offer forgiveness because forgiveness implies that what they did was somehow understandable or forgivable. What I offered was structure, consistency, and the chance to prove that they were capable of becoming better people than they'd been during their brief stint as spoiled rich kids living off stolen money. And slowly, grudgingly, I started to see something I hadn't seen from them in years. Humility. Real humility. Not the fake kind that comes from getting caught, but the genuine recognition that they'd been wrong and needed to change. The first time I heard them use Mercer again, it wasn't some dramatic announcement or tearful confession. It was Delilah, filling out paperwork at the homeless shelter, scribbling her name on a volunteer timesheet without thinking about it. When I picked her up that Saturday afternoon, the supervisor mentioned how proud they were to have Miss Mercer helping with their weekend meal service. Delilah went red as a fire truck when she realized what she'd done, like she'd been caught stealing candy from a convenience store. But she didn't try to explain it away or make excuses. She just looked at me with those eyes that were finally starting to look like my daughter's again and said, "It felt right." They started using it quietly after that, like they were testing the waters to see if I'd notice or object. Social media profiles got updated. No fanfare, no posts about going back to my roots, or any of that performative bullshit that teenagers usually pull when they want attention. Just quiet changes. Last names switched back to what they should have been all along. Grayson was more obvious about it at his tech repair job downtown. His manager called the house one evening to talk about promoting young Mr. Mercer to assistant supervisor, said the kid had real talent for fixing things and working with customers. That was the first time in months that I felt something close to pride when someone mentioned my children. The West Wing offer came after 6 months of watching them slowly become people I could recognize again. It wasn't forgiveness. I wasn't ready for that yet, and maybe I never would be. But it was recognition that they were putting in the work, day after day, without expecting immediate rewards or dramatic reconciliation scenes. The conditions were non-negotiable. They earned their privileges through consistent behavior, not birthright. Chores, grades, community service hours, therapy attendance. Everything had to stay perfect for them to keep access to their old bedrooms and the amenities that came with living in the main house instead of the downtown condo. They worked for it, and that made all the difference. No more asking for money like it was their God-given right. No more assuming that being my children automatically entitled them to anything beyond basic food and shelter. When they needed something, they presented a case for why they'd earned it. The change was subtle but unmistakable. Delilah stopped glamorizing Damien online, not just avoiding mentions of him, but actively scrubbing her social media of anything connected to that whole nightmare. The designer clothes and expensive jewelry disappeared from her posts, replaced by pictures from volunteer work and study sessions. Grayson surprised me the most. That kid who'd always been sullen and entitled started coming home from work with stories about helping customers solve problems, about learning new skills that actually mattered in the real world. He wasn't just earning a paycheck. He was building something that belonged to him. One evening, while we were eating dinner in comfortable silence, something that hadn't happened in years, Grayson looked up from his plate and asked the question that had been hanging in the air for months. "Do you still love us?" I didn't answer then. Couldn't answer, really, because love and trust aren't the same thing, and I was still figuring out where the line was between being their father and being the man they'd betrayed. But I stayed at that table, finished my dinner, helped clean up the dishes, and watched them do their homework like normal kids instead of entitled brats. That was enough for now. Maybe it would always be enough. The dinner happened on a Tuesday evening in March, 8 months after the world had watched my family implode on national television. No cameras this time. No reporters camping outside the gates. No federal agents serving warrants or seizing assets. Just 3 people sitting around a dining room table that had seen better days and worse ones, trying to figure out what came next. I'd cooked the meal myself. Nothing fancy, just grilled chicken and roasted vegetables, the kind of food that fills you up without trying to impress anyone. Delilah helped with the salad, and Grayson set the table without being asked. Small gestures, but they mattered more than all the expensive gifts and grand proclamations that had come before. The empire was safe. Mercer Security had not only survived the scandal, but actually grown stronger, picking up contracts from companies that valued discretion and resilience over flashy marketing campaigns. Turns out that when you're in the business of protecting people's secrets, having your own family drama play out in public can actually be a selling point. It proves you understand how quickly things can go sideways when you're not paying attention. My enemies were exactly where they deserved to be. Isadora was 18 months into a 10-year sentence for fraud and perjury, serving her time at a minimum security facility in Pennsylvania that was probably nicer than most people's apartments, but still had bars on the windows and guards at the doors. She tried to plea bargain her way into a shorter sentence by offering to testify against Damien, but you can't testify against a ghost. Damien himself was still missing, still hiding somewhere south of the border, where extradition treaties are more like friendly suggestions than actual legal obligations. My sources in federal law enforcement told me the trail had gone cold somewhere around Cabos and Lucas, but honestly, I didn't much care whether they ever caught him. He'd lost everything that mattered: his reputation, his business empire, his freedom to live in the country he'd spent his whole life trying to impress. That was punishment enough. But sitting there at that table, watching my children navigate normal conversation without the undercurrent of entitlement and resentment that had poisoned our family for so long, I realized that revenge had never really been the point. The point was building something that could survive betrayal, something strong enough to weather the worst that people could throw at it, and still be standing when the smoke cleared. The Mercer name isn't about blood, I said, looking across the table at two young people who were finally starting to understand what that meant. It's about who you become when no one's watching. Delilah's eyes filled with tears, not the manipulative kind she'd perfected as a teenager, but the real kind that comes from genuine understanding. Grayson just nodded, like he'd figured that out for himself somewhere between his shifts at the repair shop and his volunteer hours at the community center. I didn't say I forgave them. Maybe I never would completely. But as I watched them clear the dishes without being asked, stack the plates with care instead of carelessness, and treat our modest dinner like it mattered more than all the champagne brunches and society galas they'd left behind, I realized we were building something new. Not the family I'd lost, but the one that might actually survive whatever came next.